As part of my research for writing my next article, I researched just what were the duties that Srila Prabhupada had prescribed for the GBC to perform. On the screen, I have listed some of the instructions that Srila Prabhupada gave, where he defines some of the duties and functions of the GBC. I'll go into more detail on them later during my personal story. In 1997, I determined that the devotees were no longer respecting the GBC as they once had while Srila Prabhupada was present, because the GBC were no longer carrying out many of these functions and duties listed here on the screen. These functions were for the benefit of the members and their zones, as Srila Prabhupada had prescribed them for the GBC to do. And yet most of these functions, the GBC were no longer performing. One of the duties of the GBC is to help facilitate preaching projects. We used to be able to go to our local GBC and discuss a preaching project or idea, and if they thought it had merit, they would help give some facilities so we could carry out that project. We would approach the GBC for many of our personal and spiritual issues and temple issues. But for many years, most of the GBC were no longer performing those functions for Srila Prabhupada's disciples or other members whose gurus were no longer present. The GBC members who were now also gurus, however, they did still perform those functions, but not as a member of the GBC would perform these functions for all the members in their zone. Instead, those who were gurus, they only performed these functions in their capacity as guru only for their own disciples. Whether or not those disciples lived in the same zone where the guru lived or acted as GBC or not. And those gurus who are not members of the GBC, they still perform these functions for their disciples, but again, whether those disciples lived in their zone or not. Neither situation is the system that Srila Prabhupada had set up. Srila Prabhupada gave the instruction to the GBC to perform these functions as members of the GBC who would carry out these functions for all the members in their zone. And in general, a GBC for one zone would not be trying to resolve a personal issue of a devotee who lived in another GBC zone. That GBC wouldn't have direct insight as to the issues that devotee in the other zone was facing. Before Srila Prabhupada set up the GBC, devotees would go to Srila Prabhupada for all such issues. The reason His Divine Grace set up the GBC was so that there would be a system in place that would carry on and provide all of these services for the society after he departs. Although I knew that much at the time, in 1997, I didn't know about the Direction of Management at that time. The Direction of Management is a document by which Srila Prabhupada created the GBC. It was later that by the mercy of my dear godbrother, Narayan Prabhu, that I became aware of the Direction of Management. In the Direction of Management, Srila Prabhupada wrote, quote, "As we have increased our volume of activities, now I think a governing body commission, hereinafter referred to as the GBC, should be established. I am getting old, 75 years old. Therefore, at any time, I may be out of the scene. Therefore, I think it is necessary to give instruction to my disciples how they shall manage the whole institution." As the GBC took over these duties and functions, it also allowed Srila Prabhupada to spend more of his time with his translation work. But the primary reason that he set up the GBC is the reason that His Divine Grace himself stated in the Direction of Management, and that was to set up a system of management that could continue on in his absence. Srila Prabhupada further stated in the Direction of Management, quote, "The purpose of the governing body commission is to act as the instrument for the execution of the will of His Divine Grace." End of quote. That is the fundamental purpose, to carry out Srila Prabhupada's instructions. When the GBC ceased to perform this function, fundamental principle that is, they then ceased to be GBC. This is their fundamental purpose. It is what the GBC was created for, to carry out Srila Prabhupada's instructions. Then Srila Prabhupada gave a list of 9 items, the first of which reads, number 1, the GBC oversees all operations and management of ISKCON as it receives direction from Srila Prabhupada, and His divine grace has the final approval in all matters. End of quote. The other 8 items mostly describe the basic managerial structure as to how the GBC was to operate and their terms, which is another key issue of that direction of management. There were term limits on the GBC and elections, and it was described how elections were to be performed, but that was never implemented, but that is a whole other issue. In the foundational document, very little detail was given as to the duties and functions of the GBC. However, item number 1 stated that the GBC would manage as it receives direction from Srila Prabhupada. In other words, the direction of management document that he wrote and signed in July of 1970, Srila Prabhupada had just established the basic foundation and the shell structure of the GBC. Over the following 7 years, Srila Prabhupada would give the details regarding what their duties were to be. And on the screen, I have assembled a partial list of those duties that he had assigned the GBC over that 7-year period. It's important that we remember the very premise of this was that these duties that Srila Prabhupada assigned to the GBC were not only just to be performed at that time, but they were to be performed after Srila Prabhupada was no longer present with us. As I was doing my research on this topic, I analyzed what the system had now become in ISKCON, and I saw that it had changed drastically. A major complaint of my wife, even back in 1996, was the lack of care or concern shown by the GBC leaders towards those who were not their disciples. Well, the GBC members who are gurus perform these duties of looking out for their disciples. They do that for their disciples. But in most cases that I've seen, they are no longer rendering those services for either Prabhupada's disciples or members whose gurus have fallen or died or whatever. Back in 1990, I had gone to the North American GBC meetings to ask the GBC for their help in reviving the Fate Museum project that was very dear to Srila Prabhupada. He very much wanted. He had instructed that we were to build museums like the one we built in Los Angeles Temple. He wanted them in all of his centers all over the world. Back in 1972, when Srila Prabhupada sent Bhardraj to Mayapur to learn the ancient art of making dioramas, His Divine Grace had instructed the GBC there, Jayapataka, to give Bhardraj all facility. When Bhardraj came back to America, His Divine Grace instructed Jayatirtha, who was the GBC for Los Angeles, to give Bhardraj all facility there to make the first museum. He actually wrote and told Jayatirtha, so you act as GBC and see things are going nicely. Now Bhardraj and his wife have become expert doll makers, so give him all facilities. Let all those with artistic talent assist him. I want very extensive doll exhibits in every center. My Guru Maharaj used to spend lots of money on doll exhibits on Srimad Bhagavatam. So I am sure that if we make doll exhibits very prominent, many tourists and visitors will throng to our temples. Bhardraj and his wife have made here some dolls super excellent, successful. So utilize their talent and get others to assist them. This is from a letter to Jayatirtha written on 14th of September 1974. After making my presentation to the North American GBC, they applauded and gave their vocal approval and blessings, but they informed me that even back in 1990, they said that ISKCON had changed from what it was when Srila Prabhupada was present. They informed me that they, as GBC, are no longer able to offer any facilities. They cannot offer manpower, they cannot offer funding. While they lended their hand by clapping, that was the only support they could give. They told me they were powerless to give any actual facilities. Without their assistance, my attempts to revive the Fate project failed. In the past, the GBC, when Srila Prabhupada was present, would simply instruct the temple presidents in their zone to provide facility, money, manpower for such a project. And the GBC were given that authority by Srila Prabhupada. Previously, Srila Prabhupada would ask the temples to give facility, but he now had empowered the GBC to act on his behalf. Therefore, the temple presidents were obliged to carry out the request of their local GBC, the same as if it were that request were coming from Srila Prabhupada directly. But by 1990 even, that was no longer the case. As admitted to by the GBC members themselves, the system that Srila Prabhupada had set up had been drastically changed and was no longer functioning as His Divine Grace had intended it. Fast forward many years later, and I was speaking with a wealthy devotee who gave large donations to several of the ISKCON gurus to help their personal projects. And one of the gurus was his own guru, the other guru was his wife's guru. In the course of the conversation, I expressed my long-standing desire to revive the museum project and build these museums all over the temple, ISKCON temples, as Prabhupada had instructed us to do, as well as I wanted to start major Varna ashram farming projects. But I lacked the ability to raise funds. His observation, he told me that now in ISKCON, that the major donors like himself today, they only give money to their gurus, to those who are gurus in ISKCON, their own gurus. And he told me that if you're not a guru in ISKCON, no one is going to take you seriously or what your project you want to do. No one's going to offer help. His advice, become a guru. He said, let devotees know you will accept disciples and let your disciples know that you want funding for your projects. He told me that's the only way you'll ever get funding or manpower today in ISKCON. That's the problem. Today, the GBC men no longer have the authority to request temples to give any facility. And what he said, for the most part, was true. But it wasn't right. It isn't the system that Srila Prabhupada spent 7 years setting up, and it is not the system that he wanted his mission to be ran by in his absence. Also, this is not the reason that anyone should become a guru and accept disciples just to gain money and followers. The only reason one should become a guru is out of a strong compassion to want to save the conditioned souls and take them back to Krishna, not for money and manpower or followers. The changes in how the GBC were managing ISKCON have crippled the preaching and stifled the growth of Srila Prabhupada's movement. By the time the GBC dismantled the zonal acharya system back in 87, 88, everyone had a bad taste in their mouths regarding the guidance given by the GBC in regards to the multi-guru path that they had taken us on. The end results was most of the devotees, including temple presidents at that time, just had no faith or trust in GBC leadership. And that was in 1987. 10 years later, in 1997, the GBC were discussing how they could restore their previous respected position in the society. And that is how I began my analysis of the situation to try to help the GBC resolve this issue. I found a letter that Srila Prabhupada wrote in 1972 where he had instructed Madhadvisa to become GBC in Australia. Madhadvisa had some concerns that his new GBC duties may interfere with his sannyas duties. June 12, 1972, Srila Prabhupada wrote him, defining the duty of the GBC men thus. So I am requesting my good disciples as much as possible to consult the senior disciples in the matter of management, philosophy, and personal problems. Of course, I always welcome to get letters from my beloved disciples, but unless there is some urgent matter, it is better if all the students will address their questions from the South Pacific and Australia zone to you. 12th of June, 1972. Here Srila Prabhupada highlights 3 functions or duties that Srila Prabhupada had prescribed to the GBC to perform for the society. They were to give managerial guidance to the temples, philosophical guidance for all, and they were to address the personal problems or issues of the individual members of ISKCON. Back on the screen are excerpts from other letters Srila Prabhupada wrote instructing various GBC men in their duties. All of them are along these same lines. The GBC is to give not only managerial guidance, but they are also to give philosophical guidance, spiritual guidance. They are to address and help resolve the personal issues of the individual members. They are to take care of the spiritual well-being of the members in their zones. They are to see that we are all lovingly engaged in Krishna's service, all the members in their zones. They are to be the preachers of our teachings. In the letter to Madhadvis, Srila Prabhupada also said, quote, I want that the GBC men should leave the management of the individual centers to the local temple, local presidents, and concentrate themselves upon preaching work. They should be constantly traveling from one center to another center to see how the students are learning and to give whatever advice is necessary for improving the temple standards. In addition, the GBC men will open new centers, distribute literature, and they should always be traveling with a Sankirtan party to accompany them. I like that last part. Come with like 20, traveling around with a number of devotees and go out and do Harinam and, preaching and book distribution. And I had spent several months researching this and then wrote down my findings in an e-paper to present to the GBC. My conclusion was that the GBC needed to restore these duties and functions. These were the duties that Srila Prabhupada had prescribed to them, for them, the GBC, to perform for his ISKCON society on his behalf, especially after he departed, and to perform these functions and duties as GBC men. Yet as GBC men, they were no longer performing these duties, and that had to be corrected. It is my conclusion and firm belief that by restoring these duties back to the GBC over time, this will restore the respectful position of the GBC within the society. I did one last search on the database regarding how the GBC was to manage, and the audio transcript of Srila Prabhupada dictating his last will as well as the last will itself came up, and I came across the following.